Sachs, you've mentioned that the US war against Russia didn't stop in 1991. US kept fighting Russia after 1991 as before. Could you explain for us why do you think this way?
Basically, the U.S. wanted to make sure that it controlled or had friendly regimes in all of the territory, certainly of Central and Eastern Europe, that the Soviet Union had effectively dominated after World War II, but then in the former Soviet Union itself. So the United States idea has been to expand NATO first to Central Europe, then to Eastern Europe, then to the former Baltic states, then to Ukraine and Georgia, seemingly on an inevitable eastward journey to take over as much of the world as possible. And of course, Russia has said no to that for more than 30 years. The United States is deaf to anyone else's no, and we've ended up in a war in Ukraine because of this. So basically what we see is that the United States decided that it had the prerogative to decide which governments ruled where and where America's military bases would be and where America's missiles would be. The US abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 so that it had a free hand to put missiles in Poland and Romania. It has pushed the NATO enlargement. It's contributed to the overthrow of multiple governments by all sorts of means, sometimes overt, sometimes covert military means, sometimes getting deeply entwined in local politics and supporting financially particular candidates. But the idea is the US wants control. It wants control over Ukraine. It wants control over the Central Asian countries. It wants effectively and eventually control over Russia itself. Well, this could get us into the greatest disasters ever, because this vision is a kind of madness and an arrogance that is without limit.
Recently, I was reading a book, Ally versus Ally. If you read this book without the name of the author on the book, the last person comes to your mind gonna be Antony Blinken. But this book is so important. He describes how the Reagan administration went to great length, tried so hard to stop this Trans-Siberian pipeline. And he mentions every detail in this book. And why do you think that he changed so much, Antony Blinken? This book was published in 1987. Now in 2023, we have he's the head of the U.S. foreign policy, and we see his manner totally changed. How do you see this?
Well, I never read the first book, so I don't know what he wrote in Ally versus Ally, but I did read his recent speech, which I found to be disconnected from reality, let's say. I was very unhappy with it. It's a complete projection against other countries, China and Russia in particular, saying they do all the evil things and then listing basically the things the United States does, which is deep interference in the political affairs and lives of other countries. The US is the country that leads the world in regime change operations of other countries. It overthrows other governments for a living, we could say. Dozens and dozens and dozens of regime change operations, these so-called color revolutions in the former Soviet Union, including in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, and elsewhere, are manipulations by the US. I've seen some of it close up, some of it only I know secondhand. But basically, the US believes that it can do what it wants, overtly or covertly, militarily or through destabilization activities, or by paying local politicians or funding the campaigns of local politicians. Any one of these things would lead to the biggest scandal imaginable inside the United States if it was done by anybody else. But this is the normal mode of operation of the US government. It takes a while to understand it, by the way, because they don't exactly put this on headlines. So a very fine book written by a professor at Boston College in 2018 called Covert Regime Change details 64 US covert regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. In other words, the Cold War regime change operations. We need an updated volume to include Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and many other cases where, again, the US either overtly or covertly, in some, typically both methods, sought to overthrow or destabilize the governments of other countries. And this is getting us into an absolutely colossal mess.
If Reagan couldn't stop the Trans-Siberian pipeline, how could the US stop the even more impactful Nord Stream pipelines?
Well, they stopped it by blowing it up. So basically, Europe and Russia had a mutually beneficial trade arrangement of a lot of German industry developing on the basis of Russia's energy resources. And the US found that unacceptable, and so it blew it up. We don't know exactly how it did it. Seymour Hersh has given us, I think, a highly credible, detailed explanation. The US in its self-defense saying, oh, we didn't do it, it was the Ukrainians that did it. Some self-defense, absolutely extraordinary. But Germany is in recession right now. A lot of German industry is absolutely in decline. The German chancellor is just mum about this. I don't know, Germany just, in this case, let itself be badly damaged by its ally. Yes, so far, this is how things have gone, with the absolute quiet on the side of the Europeans, even though they know, absolutely sure they know what happened. They know the truth. They probably cleaned up the crime site so they could hide whatever evidence there is. But either the US or Ukraine, and probably the US, but if Ukraine, with US help, blew up a pipeline that was important for the European economy.
Antony Blinken just this week said that the world order is changing. He's confessing that. How do you see the US foreign policy toward Russia and China? It seems that the US foreign policy is getting more aggressive toward Russia and China. It goes to a confrontation, even war.
Of course, the US foreign policy to this moment is geared towards trying to maintain that which cannot be maintained, and that is US dominance. The world doesn't want US dominance. Russia doesn't accept it. China doesn't accept it. But the United States is extremely arrogant or naive. When you read Blinken's speech, nothing is real, nothing is true. And you wonder, is he completely just lying at each point, or is he so naive that he really doesn't understand the situation? I don't know the answer, frankly, to that. I found the speech amazing in how cliched and juvenile it is. The fact of the matter is the United States is continuing to try to maintain its dominance. By the way, he talks about how important it is for the openness of flows of technology and so forth. And he seems not aware that it is his government that is trying to throttle China by restricting the flows of technology to China. I mean, there's no serious discussion in this document at all. Yes, he acknowledges this is a hinge moment, I think he quotes Biden as calling it. But the whole speech is a bunch of cliches about why the United States needs to maintain its power and why those who don't want the US leadership are just evil. Russia and China are evil. And so they need to be combated. And this is the great struggle. And if you frame the world this way, you just are not telling the truth and not explaining what's really going on. The United States is the country with military bases in 85 countries around the world. It's the one that pushes military enlargement. It is the biggest user of unilateral coercive economic measures, which are against international law. Here, also in this document, Blinken talks about the economic coercion by China. Are you kidding? The United States, by every objective account, is way in the lead of using unilateral coercive measures against whole economies, often for decades, such as Cuba or Venezuela or Iran. Not a mention of this reality at all, just how terrible it is what China's doing. It's a game, but it's so thin, so meager, and so lacking any kind of credibility that maybe some innocent students listening to this at Johns Hopkins believe it, but I don't think anyone outside in the world would believe this stuff.
In those days that Reagan wanted to stop this Trans-Siberian pipeline, there was Helmut Schmidt and other politicians in Europe, Margaret Thatcher. They were trying to resist this foreign policy. But nowadays, we don't see any resistance, any disagreement with the US foreign policy in Europe. How do you see the role of Europe in bringing the US foreign policy to some sort of sanity?
You know, it's interesting if you look up the approval ratings of national leaders around the world. Every European leader is in the red right now. There are no popular European leaders. They have sided with the United States. They have put Europe itself at risk. They have sacrificed European interests for American hegemonic aspirations, which are both an illusion and an impossibility. But Europe has gone along with this to a person in the national leaders, with the exception of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has told the truth all along that this is not in Europe's interest. And he has received a lot of opprobrium from the other European leaders, though Orban has been the one speaking the truth. So this is not giving any political return to these leaders. There's no groundswell of support in Europe for these policies. The media are absolutely in line with the US line. And I don't fully understand the ownership structure of the media and direct linkages and reasons why this would be. But this is not the public will. The public sees things are going bad and getting worse. And I think that this will give rise to new voices in Europe, but the current heads of governments are just falling in line with the US. And even Macron, who once in a while says something different, every time he does say something different, the next day he comes back into line. It's a little hard to understand, frankly, but it's, for me, rather shocking and disappointing, the lack of insight in Europe in all of this, among the leaders.
I think Macron totally understands if he stops the French ties with China, it's going to be so devastating for Europe. Do you think that they're going to go the same way that they went toward Russia? They're going to consider the same manner they have toward Russia against China as well?
So far, they're doing the American bidding in this. So far, they're falling into line. I just saw, again, I may be paraphrasing, and it was just a banner across the news stream that said that President von der Leyen called Xi Jinping a dictator, following the kind of empty and nasty rhetoric of Biden. So, yes, they play the Washington game. Why? I don't know, because it's not going to work for Europe. It's not going to work for the United States. It's very troubling and naive. I had discussions with Josep Borrell about these issues a couple of years ago, but he fell completely 100% into the U.S. neocon camp, even repeating their words about the garden and the jungle, which is a pure U.S. Neocon rhetoric, and very disappointing. And no voice in Europe that stands up against this right now, not among the national leaders.
How long they can keep stopping this pipeline, Nord Stream pipeline? Do you think, is there any possibility, in your opinion, that this pipeline gonna work again?
Again is a big word. Could it work again? Yes. Could it work again in the next year or two? No. And not just because of the technical repair issue. I mean, because of the geopolitical issue. But we have to remember, even back in the Crimean War, which was an earlier version of this current war, because in 1853 to 1856, Britain and France fought Russia, quite similar to now. They didn't have drones then, but the idea was to destroy the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Same objectives, because the physical geography is the same. And Britain was every bit as imperialistic and xenophobic and Russophobic as now back then. But the point I want to make is that within a couple of decades, France and Russia were again allies after all of this, because in the meantime, Germany had arisen as a major power, and France wanted a balancing friend. And that turned out it would be Russia. So it's quite interesting how geopolitics changes over time. And President Kennedy once famously said 60 years ago that across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Things shift, alliances shift. All of this Russophobia right now could go away in 10 years or 15 years for other reasons. Right now, this is a hatred being stoked daily by terrible speeches by our Secretary of State and shocking warmongering by our columnists in the New York Times and elsewhere. But in 10 years, it could be something quite different because these are phony positions, and they can change because of new circumstances.